Hey writer, if you're ready to level up, then buckle up. Get your pen and paper ready. It's time for another episode of the Art and Business of Writing podcast.
Hey guys, welcome back to another edition of the Art and Business of Writing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and today my guest is Aubrey Kosa. Aubrey graduated from Christopher Newport University with a Bachelor in Arts in English Writing and a double minor in Leadership Studies and Psychology. She has worked in a number of industries, including publishing, pharmaceutical marketing, barn management, payroll customer service, and proposal writing for government contractors. Aubrey's developed a passion for storytelling, helping others communicate clearly. In pursuit of that passion, she's provided freelance editing services for nonfiction authors since 2016. Her goal is to help authors create a polished final manuscript and navigate the publishing process so they can spend less time on the details and more time focused on the big picture message. So please welcome Aubrey Kosa.
Hey, Aubrey, welcome to the podcast today. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, I'm doing wonderful. So let's start off by telling us, I want you to tell us more about your life as an editor. So what do you do in your day-to-day?
Yeah, absolutely. So day to day is really in the thick of it with the words. So it's going line by line editing. It's sometimes talking authors through the publishing process, the pros and cons of different types of publishing, talking them through the different kinds of editing, what their book might need, going over edits. So kind of a day-to-day is a mix of everything, but mostly it's just me and the Word document on my computer screen.
So you edit for a New York publishing house. Tell us how that came about.
Yes, so I work as a freelance editor, and then I also worked for a New York publishing house at the same time. So that that particular publishing house doesn't do in-house editing, but I actually started with them as an intern my senior year of college. So I was doing a lot of marketing copy for authors, press releases, things like that. And I ended up really connecting with the publishing director at this company, and she and three of her close friends were actually looking for a ghostwriter to write a book. So they gave me the opportunity to ghostwrite for them, and that kind of landed me into doing different freelancing. Was that kind of first opportunity, and then I also ended up working for the publishing company full time once I graduated from college.
Now, I want you to clear something up for our audience that tends to confuse people a lot. What is the difference between an editor and a proofreader? Because oftentimes people unknowingly use those synonymously, though those roles are quite different, right?
Yes, absolutely. So an editor is really going to be more detailed. They'll be looking at anywhere from big picture comments of organization of your book. They could be making recommendations for moving paragraphs around, adding chapters, getting rid of sections, a lot more big picture items. A proofreader, on the other hand, is kind of your last step. So that this is the final person to look at your book before it actually goes to print. So this person doesn't necessarily need to have a lot of background on your content. For an editor, if I'm editing a book on a more big picture level, I'll have conversations with authors before I even look at the Word document. But for a proofreader, they don't really need that. They're really looking for those black and white changes, things like typos, things like grammar, things that aren't really subjective. So that's kind of the main difference between proofreading and editing.
I'm sure you come across that a lot, don't you? Where people say, hey, can you edit my book? And they think you're talking about proofreading or vice versa, huh?
Absolutely. So that's usually the first conversation that I have with someone when they reach out for me to me for editing services is I will talk to them about where they are in the process. I'll ask them if anyone has already looked at their book. Just kind of have that conversation and get a feel for what their book needs. Some authors will end up having a lot more steps and people involved in the editing process, and some authors are kind of just lean naturally towards that writing and organizing, and they might not need as much help as someone else.
Now, do you edit fiction and nonfiction, or just one or the other?
I only do nonfiction. For me, I could, do kind of like a proofread for a fiction book, since again, that's not really looking at the big picture content. But when it comes to editing, I really thrive with nonfiction books, especially business and self development. And I think you kind of have to find your niche, in any industry, but as an editor, kind of know your limits. And for me, just trying to wrap my mind around how to make changes to a fictional story, it's just never really been my cup of tea. So I kind of know my limit there and stick to what I'm really good at.
Oh, I'm with you on that. I'm always like outsourcing fiction books because people will come to me and say, "Hey, look, do you do fiction?" I'm like, I barely read fiction. So,
Yeah.
so for me to edit fiction for me to even look at a fiction book is a wash.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the various types of editing. From general editing to line editing to structural editing to developmental editing. Can you walk us through each of the types of editing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, everyone's got slightly different, slightly different language for what they call the different levels of editing, but I like to think of them in kind of four main levels. So the biggest picture level is going to be ghostwriting, and this is really where the author has content, and they might have the content in a different format. So, for example, I've done one where an author has an email series that they were sending out to an email list, and they wanted it turned into a book. So you're basically taking the content, whether it's already written out, whether that's in their head, and you're doing the writing. So that's why it's called ghostwriting, kind of like invisible little ghosts during the writing, in the author's voice using their content. So that's kind of the biggest level. Um, and then the next one is looking at structural or developmental or content editing. Those are kind of all different words for the same thing, and that's looking at the big picture of the book, the organization, how everything flows, the order of the chapters and the order within the chapters, the different parts of the book. Just kind of again looking at that big picture, and then you zoom into a line edit, or sometimes this is called a copy edit, but this is really the line by line editing of things, and this is definitely a step up from that final proofread because, while it's not quite at the level of maybe reorganizing chapters within the book, sometimes it's moving paragraphs around. It's, cutting some content, maybe adding a little bit of content, but on a much more micro level, a sentence by sentence level. So you do a line edit usually after everyone is happy with the structure of the book overall, and then it's zooming in on the line by line of it. And then that final stage is the proofread, which we've already talked about a little bit, and it's an important step because once someone has looked at the book enough times, and that includes the author and any editors who were involved in a line edit or a structural edit, once they've seen it enough times, it kind of starts looking like wallpaper. So you've got to have a fresh set of eyes do that final proofread, just to catch typos and grammatical things that have slipped past everybody else.
So from what I gather, some books can use multiple editors, right? Multiple types of
Absolutely.
edits.
Yep, absolutely. And usually I recommend this for authors is, I think the majority of authors are looking for that line edit, just that line by line help. And then I usually recommend that a fresh set of eyes just do a final proofread. And sometimes that doesn't even necessarily have to be a professional proofreader. If someone has done a really thorough professional line edit, and kind of like a family friend or just someone who hasn't seen the book yet can look through it for those typos or things that were missed.
Yeah. Now, who needs what type of editing generally? Like, what type of author would need each of these different types of editing, or do they need multiple rounds of the same types of editing?
Yeah. So, first, a lot of first time authors um, can really benefit from that structural review, just depending on how comfortable they are with the writing process. Some authors are just innately comfortable with the writing process and organizing their book, and so they'll go through the whole process of writing before they even involve anybody else, and it's already in really good shape. I would say I almost 99% of authors do need that line edit, that just another set of eyes to really look through, make sure everything is connecting well, is flowing well. Really the point of an editor is to make sure that the author's message is communicated as clearly as possible, for their audience. So I think all authors can benefit from that line by line edit. And then a proofread, again, that's a really important final step. But even authors who maybe are taking the first version of their book and updating it, I always recommend they get another proofread just to make sure that everything is still good to go. Um, all that to say, most authors will need that line edit, and a lot of first time authors can benefit from the more bigger picture services as well.
All right, so let's talk about writing style books. What style books should authors be familiar with, and which ones do you recommend that they use depending on the genre they're in?
Yeah, absolutely. In the publishing industry, most publishers will recommend using Chicago style, and that's the most accepted, industry wide. Although, there's exceptions to every rule, right? Especially in English. So some academic books will use APA, and some editors will kind of use a mix, just depending on what the author's preference is and how strict the publishing house is as well, because some publishing houses are a little more lenient with which style is followed for their books, and some are insistent on everything must be exactly the latest version of Chicago style.
All right. And so, what's the role of an editor, and what's the typical editorial process look like for you? Like when you get a manuscript, what do you do?
Well, the first thing I do is have that conversation with the author just to see how comfortable they are with the process, where they are in the process, who's looked at the book so far, what they're looking for. So that's typically the first thing I do is have that conversation. And for me, since I've worked in the publishing industry, that conversation also usually involves talking through where they are in the publishing process, different options if they haven't settled on a publisher yet, if they're debating self-publishing um, versus going with a New York publishing house or a more hybrid model, just kind of talking through all of that with them. Um, and then once we've decided on what level of editing, usually I will take the document and I'll go through, do the edit, use track changes. And for me, I always send a couple different versions back to authors, so they can look through all the changes the way that they want to. And then, you know, I, it's just kind of a back and forth until we get to a final product. So, the biggest role is really focusing on the words, but editors, have a lot of other value as well, especially if someone's, especially those who have also worked very closely either in or, with authors through the publishing process. That's really valuable to authors as well. And the other thing that I usually do in my process is make sure that the Word document is formatted correctly for the publishing house that they're going with. So it's making sure that everything will be communicated to the design team in the way that the author wants it to.
Okay, and with editorial change, does an author have to accept the changes? And then when should they accept them without question, and when should they maybe object to a change or defer to what feels good to them?
It's a great question. Absolutely, they don't have to accept all the changes, especially when it comes to those more big picture line edits. With things like wording or changing out words for synonyms, if what an editor has done, sometimes they don't. Sometimes, as an editor, I may not fully understand what the author meant in a sentence, and so I make a change that changes the meaning of the sentence. So when the author's going through that, they might reject that change, and then we'll talk through that and maybe come up with a different change. Where I usually ask authors to accept is anything that is style guide related. So I typically use Chicago style, like we talked about, and um, anything that has to do with Chicago style or grammar or punctuation, anything that's very black and white, kind of more on that proofreading level. I usually recommend that authors trust those changes. And then for the other changes that are more subjective, those are the ones that we kind of go through. And some authors will actually do a call and talk through the list of changes that they're not sure about. And then we come up with, what's going to be best, and we make sure it's consistent throughout the document.
Okay, so talk about like editor red flags when dealing with an author.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you know, for, when you're looking for an editor, you definitely want someone who is very detail oriented and organized, and you can usually tell that by talking to someone, or even kind of the information that they send you via email, if they're very organized and and have a very clear process. You want someone who knows grammar very well, who's either gone through like a course or has a background in English and grammar and writing. You also want to make sure that they know the style guide that you're using. So a big red flag if you're looking for an editor and they don't, and they're not adhering to a specific style guide. A red flag that that just for me personally is if editors charge by the hour. I always charge by project or word count, just because sometimes as an editor, I'll spend a really long time looking for a synonym that I want for a word. And so it kind of charging by the hour to do something like editing is always a red flag to me, because that's so, it just seems a little sketchy to me. And that may be a personal red flag, but you want to make sure that your editor has that background and has questions for you when it comes to preferred spellings of things and consistency, and you want to kind of get the feeling that they know the options, and want to make sure that your book is consistent and aligned with the publishing house that you're going with.
Okay. And why might a publisher require you to hire an editor for your book to begin with?
That's a great question as well, and one I've gotten a lot from authors. And so the biggest reason that a publisher might have you go to an outside editor is if you are publishing through a publishing house that allows you to maintain the intellectual property for your book. So with a lot of the big publishers, when you sign that contract, you're actually giving them the IP the intellectual property that is in your book. So basically, they own the content, which is why they have in-house editors who are going to make the changes, because now they own the content, and so they can make those changes. With a publishing house that allows you to keep your intellectual property, which is a huge pro for a lot of nonfiction authors, because then you can take that content and repurpose it. But if the publishing house does not have if they don't own the IP, then they don't want to be making changes with an in-house editor. So that's why, some publishing houses that allow authors to keep their IP also require them to get the book edited outside of the publishing house. That way, the author maintains 100% control of the content with their editor, and the publishing house isn't the one making those changes.
Okay. And so, what should an author expect to pay for editing?
So it does depend on the level of editing, of course. Um, Anywhere from, for a line edit, anywhere from like $7 to $10 per 250 words, which is about a page, kind of depending, of course, on how things are formatted. So, just to give an example, for a 60,000 word book, which usually translates to about like 200 pages in a 6x9 format. So 60,000 words for a line edit can be, anywhere from like 1,500 to 2,000 to do that line edit.
And so, what happens when an author says, "Well, I just can't afford an editor"? Like, what do you advise them? How do you talk them off the ledge and say, "Yeah, well, you have to have an editor because that's your biggest asset"?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, a lot of I do kind of talk them through usually, how important it is, but also I usually um, offer some options as well. So, for me personally, I'll kind of, break it up into smaller payments. But I also think that what authors can do if they're really in a bind and can't afford to have that professional line edit, is they can look to someone who might have who maybe is not a professional editor but has like an editing background, someone like if they have a high school teacher friend. And usually I don't recommend this unless someone's like really backed into a corner, but if they have someone who's familiar with grammar or is good at writing, look at it and do a more bigger picture edit, and then they have a professional do that final proofread. And for me as a professional, if I'm doing that final proofread in a situation like that, usually I'll kind of look for those more big picture things at the same time, and a proofread is less going to be less expensive than a line edit. So usually I'll recommend that they maybe just do that lower level of edit with a professional after having someone else take a look and kind of help them do the bigger picture edits if they're really in a bind.
All right. And you mentioned that a proofread is typically significantly less than an edit. What's a proofread typically go for? Just so
As
an author has a
Yeah.
frame of mind and reference.
So a proofread is more like $2 to $3 per 250 words. So for the same book, the same like 60,000 word book, it would be um, between like 400 and 600 usually for a proofread.
And now, what do you say, when an author says, "Well, can I use a machine editor like Grammarly or Word or Pro Writing Aid?" Like, what do you say to them about those tools? Because I mean, they're great tools to use, but they're not perfect.
Right. Yeah. That's a great question. I actually have not ever had to answer that for an author, but for me, it really takes the human element out of that. And, those, like you said, those are great tools and they can catch a lot of black and white things. But they're not going to catch the nuances that a human editor would be able to catch. So things, just it's almost like how Word will, red underline some names and things that aren't necessarily incorrect, but the computer thinks are incorrect. For example, there's different ways to spell. Um, there's different ways to spell certain words that are both correct. And so, you have an editor who is keeping a running list and a style guide. And that's a big part of the line edit as well that I forgot to mention is usually a line editor will keep a style guide for the proofreader so that the proofreader knows what they're looking for. So that'll have that style guide that the line editor makes will have spelling preferences of the author. It'll have names in there, anything that's very specific to that author's book, and it'll have general style guide rules in there as well. So those are things that a machine can't necessarily do well.
Right. All right. So lastly, on the flip side, for our listeners who may want to pursue becoming an editor or a proofreader, where should they begin?
I think a really good resource to becoming a proofreader or editor is actually there's a book called Work from Home by Caitlin Pyle. And she does a really great job kind of breaking down the basics of starting a proofreading business, much better than I could. So she does a great job doing that, and she also has proofreading courses as well. So if you're not someone who necessarily came from an English background or an editing background, for me it was it really was situational for me. Coming from an English writing internship and then getting into the publishing world. I think that was a really good segue for me, but even just a basic proofreading course is a great place to start.
All right. You know what? I do actually have one final question because I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question. and it's where does an author find editors?
So this is a great question as well. I always recommend starting with Google, but also depending on the publishing house that you're working with. Some of them have like Facebook groups for authors, and I know a lot of authors will ask other authors for recommendations because you can do a Google search and kind of look at who's out there and what kind of services they offer, but really asking other authors, or if you don't know other authors, then kind of just looking to see what you can find by Googling.
Oh, that works. Awesome. Well, Aubrey, thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You gave us a nice, thorough, rounded education on the value of a proofreader, what a proofreader does, how to find proofreaders, what they charge. You did just a super job. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
How's that for inspiring? I hope you take action on one thing you learned in today's episode. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast and left a review on iTunes, I want to encourage you to do that too. Finally, be sure to visit chrisjonesinc.com to sign up for updates. Don't worry, I won't spam you. And we'll see you back here next week for another episode.